Most stories ask us to witness events. What Remains of Edith Finch asks us to inhabit them. At its core, What Remains of Edith Finch is a game about death. One by one, members of the Finch family die in strange, tragic, and often deeply unusual ways. As players, we are invited to step into fragments of their lives and experience their final moments firsthand. On paper, many of them are surprisingly simple, yet when they are combined with interactivity and player agency, they become something far more difficult to replicate in any other medium. But what makes these stories so memorable isn't simply the fact that they end tragically, it's the way they blur the boundaries between reality and interpretation. These memories rarely feel entirely real. Instead, they exist somewhere between fact and fiction, memory and imagination, between what happened and how it was remembered. But this video isn't about analyzing the game as a whole. Instead, the focus is on a single character, arguably one of the most important figures in the entire narrative.
My brother was really cool. I wish you could have met him.
The most fascinating thing about Lewis Finch's story isn't what happens to him, it's what happens to you. His story isn't simply a story about escapism, it is an experience of escapism. In just 15 minutes, the game accomplishes something that many narratives struggle to achieve across dozens of hours. And that is why, nearly a decade later, it remains one of the most remarkable examples of interactive storytelling.
Everyone always told me to stay out of Lewis's room, except Lewis.
Before we can fully understand why Lewis Finch's story is so impactful, we first need to understand Lewis himself. Lewis Finch is a young man who works at a local fish cannery. Through the observations and notes of his psychiatrist, we slowly get a clear picture of who Lewis really is. After quitting drugs, Lewis becomes extremely productive at work, but at the same time, something else begins growing inside his mind. He starts building an imaginary world. At first, this fantasy is insignificant and simple, just a tiny maze in the corner of his mind, but little by little it expands. It becomes more detailed and more emotionally important to him. Inside this fantasy, Lewis creates an entirely different life. Somewhere he can finally see himself as admired and powerful. He makes friends, he builds a kingdom, he conquers cities, and he falls in love. All of these events are happening while Lewis is simply standing in a fish cannery, repeating the same mechanical task over and over again. And honestly, this experience is familiar to most people. Especially for people with repetitive jobs, there's often a point where the body continues functioning automatically while the mind drifts somewhere else. The routine becomes so mechanical that the brain almost disconnects from the physical action itself. In those moments, imagination becomes a form of escape. Psychologically, daydreaming is not inherently unhealthy. In fact, it's one of the most natural functions of the human mind. A huge amount of art, storytelling, music, philosophy, and even personal ambition comes from humanity's ability to mentally leave reality for a short time. In its healthy form, daydreaming doesn't separate a person from reality. It expands reality. So the issue isn't imagination itself. The real psychological question is, what kind of relationship does a person develop with their fantasy world? Daydreaming slowly turns destructive when it starts involving withdrawal from reality. And that's exactly what Lewis experiences. At the beginning of the consequence, his fantasy world only occupies a tiny part of the screen. Reality is still dominant. His imagination exists only in the background. But as the story progresses, his imagination slowly becomes larger and more detailed. The fantasy gains a structure, emotion, and complexity. Meanwhile, reality begins fading into the background. Even though Lewis is technically still cutting fish heads at the cannery, the task itself starts feeling secondary. His real focus is no longer the physical world around him, but the fantasy inside his mind. And eventually, there's a complete psychological shift. The imagination overtakes reality entirely. What started as ordinary daydreaming slowly evolves into something much more dangerous: maladaptive daydreaming. People experiencing maladaptive daydreaming often become emotionally attached to the imagined realities and lose the track of time during immersion. But unfortunately, that's not the only thing happening to Lewis. Another important concept connected to Lewis is escapism. Psychologically, escapism refers to the tendency to mentally withdraw from reality into fantasy, entertainment, or alternative experiences that provide relief, meaning, or comfort. Human beings constantly escape reality. In healthy amounts, escapism is actually essential for psychological survival. Escapism becomes psychologically dangerous when a person's identity becomes dependent on escape, or when reality starts feeling emotionally unbearable. Based on what the game shows us, we know that Lewis is a gamer, and video games are one of the richest forms of escapism ever created. They provide control, progression, and identity in ways reality sometimes cannot. But Lewis's situation is different. When he's forced into the environment of the fish cannery, an environment built entirely around repetition and emotional emptiness, he no longer has access to his usual forms of escapism, like video games, books, or other distractions, so his mind creates its own. And at first, this fantasy genuinely helps him cope, but over time, the relationship between Lewis and his imagination changes. The escapism stops functioning as relief and slowly becomes dependency. And eventually, Lewis no longer sees the fantasy as just fantasy. He starts identifying with it. In his mind, the real Lewis is no longer the young man standing inside a fish cannery. The real Lewis becomes the prince inside his kingdom. We also need to look at Lewis's situation from a philosophical perspective, and one of the philosophies that explains his condition surprisingly well is absurdism. Albert Camus believed that one of the most painful facts about human existence is that human beings naturally search for meaning, purpose, and identity, but the universe doesn't automatically provide any of them. We want life to feel meaningful and to believe our existence matters, but reality often feels cold and mechanical instead. And according to Camus, the clash between humanity's need for meaning and the silence of reality creates something called the absurd. Think about the fish cannery for a second. Everything about it feels spiritually empty because the cannery reduces existence to pure function. It turns life into mechanical repetition. That's why Lewis's fantasy world becomes psychologically necessary for him, because human beings can't survive entirely on function alone. So if you look at this situation through the lens of philosophy, Lewis is ultimately just trying to destroy the absurd and give meaning to his life. And to be honest, that's the same thing all of us are doing in one way or another. That's exactly why Lewis feels more relatable and emotionally compelling than almost any other character in the game. But wait a second, is Lewis's imaginary kingdom truly fake? This is where we arrive at one of humanity's oldest philosophical dilemmas. What if fantasy is better? Most stories completely condemn escapism, but What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't fully say that. Instead, it asks a genuinely disturbing question. What if fantasy actually feels more meaningful than reality? What if the fantasy feels more real than the real world itself? Between happiness inside an imaginary world and pain, emptiness, and emotional suffering in reality, which one is actually more human? And honestly, there probably isn't one absolute answer. Now that we have explored the psychological and philosophical dimensions of Lewis Finch's story, we can finally arrive at the most important question of this video. Why does this sequence work so powerfully as a video game? Or perhaps more importantly, why would it lose so much of its power in almost any other medium? The answer can be summarized in a single word: interactivity. Most storytelling mediums work through observation. In books, films, or TV shows, the audience watches a character. We observe their emotions, understand their psychology, and empathize with them from a distance. Even at their most immersive, these mediums still keep the viewer outside the experience itself. But this sequence doesn't just show escapism or dissociation, it makes the player experience the structure of it firsthand. During Lewis's section, the player is constantly repeating the same mechanical labor, cutting fish heads over and over again. At first, doing two things simultaneously feels difficult. Your attention keeps shifting between the factory work and Lewis's fantasy world, but over time something changes. The repetitive movement becomes automatic. Your hands continue working almost unconsciously, while more and more of your focus drifts toward the fantasy kingdom. And that's exactly what's happening to Lewis himself. The gameplay slowly recreates his psychological state inside the player's mind. The fantasy stops feeling like a distraction and starts becoming the primary experience, and reality fades into the background. A movie could absolutely show Lewis zoning out. It could visually portray fantasy overtaking reality, but a game can do something much more unique. It can directly manipulate the player's attention. It can make you experience escapism or dissociation. It can train the player to divide focus between two realities and turn repetitive movement into muscle memory. The game conditions you to care less about the factory and more about the imaginary kingdom. And because you actively participate in that process, Lewis's escapism stops feeling abstract. This is something passive mediums fundamentally struggle to replicate. The final sequence of Lewis Finch's life ends in suicide. The coronation scene is philosophically brilliant. The crown represents something larger than a simple fantasy image. It symbolizes complete immersion in imagination, but the disturbing part is the player wants the coronation too. That's why the final moment feels so contradictory. It's terrifying, beautiful, and tragic all at once. By the time Lewis reaches the crown, something important has already happened. The player has emotionally crossed into the fantasy world alongside him. The coronation feels so powerful because, on some level, the player also understands the desire behind it. It doesn't feel foreign, it feels understandable. A film viewer might simply think Lewis is losing himself, but a player experiences something closer to, I understand why he doesn't want to come back. That alignment between player and character isn't just written into the story, it is produced through gameplay itself. At this point, it becomes clear that the real narrative is not located in Lewis alone or in the mechanics alone. It exists somewhere in the space between them. This is why the sequence would lose much of its impact if it were translated into a passive medium. The emotional structure depends on participation inspiration, not just observation. Lewis Finch ultimately demonstrates something essential about video games as a medium. For 15 minutes, What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't simply ask us to observe Lewis's escapism, it asks us to inhabit it, to gradually drift away from reality alongside him. And that's precisely why the sequence remains so powerful, not because we agree with Lewis, not because we want to make the same choice as he does, but because for a brief moment we understand him, we understand the desire to escape. And through gameplay, that understanding becomes something deeper than empathy. It becomes experience.